In January 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, one man refused to believe the war was lost. So he did something strange. He ordered his architects to keep building. 9 meters underground beneath a dying city sat a fortress designed not to win a war, but to delay an ending. Its walls were built in layers, each one added as the war grew worse, as if enough concrete could hold back reality itself. This is the Führerbunker, and long before its final days, its architecture had already started telling the story of the man who would never leave it, a story of paranoia, denial, and a regime that built itself into a corner it could never escape. Over the next 14 minutes, we'll walk through every level of this structure, room by room, and trace exactly how it came to be the place where the Third Reich finally ended. The story doesn't start with war, it starts with routine precaution. In 1936, 3 years after Hitler came to power, a simple air raid shelter was built beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in central Berlin. At the time, Germany wasn't yet at war, and the shelter was little more than a basic concrete box designed for short visits during the occasional air raid drill. It had a single low corridor and a handful of small rooms, nothing more elaborate than what any government building of the era might install as standard precaution. Nobody working on it that year could have imagined that this modest structure, tucked beneath an ordinary government garden, would one day become the final address of the Third Reich and the place where its founder would take his own life less than a decade later. By 1943, the war had changed everything above ground. Allied bombers were reaching Berlin with growing frequency, and the old shallow shelter, now referred to as the Führerbunker, simply wasn't safe enough anymore. So German engineers began excavating a second, much deeper level directly beneath the first. This new structure, the Führerbunker proper, was built to survive a direct hit from above. Its walls were poured almost 3 meters thick, reinforced with dense steel rebar salvaged from other wartime construction projects. It had its own air filtration system, capable of scrubbing poison gas from incoming air, and its own diesel generator for electricity, entirely independent of Berlin's increasingly unreliable city power grid. This wasn't a temporary shelter anymore. It was becoming a self-contained underground command post, built for a war its architects still expected at that point to last for years. To reach the deepest level of the complex, a visitor passed through checkpoint after checkpoint. First, a disguised entrance hidden inside an ordinary-looking garden pavilion, made to appear unremarkable from above to anyone flying overhead. Then a narrow spiral staircase descending nearly 10 meters straight down. And finally, a massive rounded steel blast door, sealed with thick rubber gaskets designed to block gas attacks completely, the same design principle used in military submarines of the era. Armed SS guards stood watch at every single stage of this descent. The architecture itself functioned as a filter, screening out anyone without explicit clearance. The deeper into the bunker a person went, the fewer people around them were trusted to follow, until only a small inner circle remained with access to the lowest, most secure rooms. Past the final blast door sat the map room, widely considered the operational heart of the entire bunker complex. Here, senior generals gathered daily around a long wooden table covered in detailed paper maps, moving small wooden blocks across them to represent entire army divisions. But by early 1945, many of those same divisions existed only on that table. In reality, they had already been destroyed in combat, fully encircled by advancing Soviet forces, or had simply stopped responding to radio contact days or even weeks earlier. The room itself was heavily soundproofed and completely sealed from the outside world, which meant that inside its walls the war could still be managed, debated, and planned for in careful detail. Outside those same walls, the war had, in every practical and military sense, already been decided. Down a final corridor sat the private living quarters, and they were strikingly plain for a regime otherwise famous for its love of grandeur, marble, and spectacle. A narrow single bed, a simple writing desk, one small lamp, nothing more. No grand furnishings, no ornate decoration of any kind. Beyond these personal rooms, dozens of secretaries, telephone operators, cooks, and armed guards lived and worked in similarly cramped spaces for weeks at a time, sharing recycled air and rationed food, rarely if ever seeing daylight, while above them artillery impacts regularly shook loose fresh dust and small fragments of concrete from the ceiling. A small switchboard room connected the bunker to whatever remained of the German military command Satitar, structures spread across the collapsing country. Telephone lines ran out from this single room toward army groups, major cities, and regional command posts throughout what was left of the Reich. But by April 1945, a growing number of those lines led absolutely nowhere at all, connecting only to units that had already surrendered, retreated past any recognizable formation, or simply ceased to exist as functioning fighting forces. The bunker's isolation, in the end, wasn't only physical. Reliable information itself had almost entirely stopped flowing in from the outside world. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced rapidly and steadily from the east, a decisive choice was finally made. The bunker would no longer serve merely as an occasional wartime refuge for emergencies. It would become the full permanent seat of government for whatever remained of the Third Reich. Furniture, filing cabinets, sensitive communication equipment, and key personal staff all moved in for what everyone involved quietly understood would be an extended, indefinite stay underground. What had once been a place to wait out a single bombing raid for an hour or two was now, in every functional sense, the last working capital of Nazi Germany. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, moved into the bunker complex along with his wife Magda and their 6 young children ranging in age from just 4 to 12 years old. In the middle of a violently collapsing war, inside a fortress built from thick concrete and reinforced steel doors, 6 children played, studied their schoolwork, and slept in the very same corridors as armed soldiers and exhausted, sleep-deprived staff. It remains one of the strangest and most unsettling details of the entire complex, a deliberate attempt at preserving something resembling ordinary family normalcy, staged directly beside the grinding machinery of a regime's final desperate defense of itself. On April the 20th, 1945, Hitler briefly came above ground for what would prove to be the very last time. In the already ruined Chancellery Garden, he awarded medals to a small group of teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth, some of them barely old enough to hold a rifle steadily, while Soviet artillery already fell in a steady rhythm on the city's outer districts nearby. It was his 56th birthday. It was also, as history would record, the last time he would ever see open daylight for the remainder of his life. By late April, Soviet artillery shells were landing within just a few city blocks of the Chancellery building itself. Below ground, the bunker's diesel generators strained around the clock to keep the lights running and the air filtration system operating, powering a government that, in practical terms, no longer controlled anything meaningful beyond these few remaining corridors. Every explosion felt from above sent fresh dust and small fragments of loosened concrete falling steadily from the ceiling onto the desks, scattered maps, and simple sleeping cots below. On April 29th, in a small plain room down the same corridor as the map room, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, quiet, and strictly private ceremony witnessed by only a small handful of people. Almost immediately afterward, he sat down and dictated his final political and personal testament, a lengthy document that, even at this final hour with the city collapsing around him, continued blaming Germany's own military leadership, its exhausted people, and international jury for the total catastrophe unfolding just a few meters above his head. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew together into his private study and quietly closed the door behind them. A single gunshot was heard from inside a short time later. When staff finally entered the room, they found both of them dead. Following detailed instructions Hitler had given well in advance, their bodies were carried up the narrow emergency stairwell into the bombed-out Chancellery garden above, doused thoroughly in petrol carried up in jerry cans, and set alight, a final deliberate attempt to deny advancing Soviet forces the propaganda value of ever displaying his remains publicly. The following day, Magda Goebbels made a decision that still deeply shocks historians studying this period today. She had all 6 of her children given sedatives to make them fall asleep, then had cyanide capsules crushed between their teeth one by one while they lay unconscious, unaware of what was happening to them. She and her husband Joseph took their own lives shortly afterward, in the very same garden where Hitler's body had been burned only hours earlier that same day. With their leaders now dead, the remaining bunker staff faced an almost impossible choice: surrender directly to advancing Soviet troops, or attempt a desperate, chaotic breakout through a city that had already been reduced to burning rubble. Most of those who attempted the breakout that particular night did not survive until morning. The bunker itself, once among the most heavily guarded structures anywhere in Berlin, was simply left behind entirely, its corridors abandoned mid-use, papers still scattered across the map room table exactly as they had been the moment everyone finally chose to walk away for good. Soviet forces formally entered and secured the bunker complex on May 2, 1945, finding it largely intact but eerily, completely empty. Over the following years, much of the structure was partially demolished by Soviet military engineers using controlled explosive charges. Then, decades later in the 1980s, East German authorities took the additional deliberate step of burying and completely flattening whatever structures still remained, determined above all to prevent the site from ever becoming any kind of memorial, gathering place, or rallying symbol for future extremist political movements. Today, the exact site sits beneath an entirely ordinary residential parking lot in central Berlin, surrounded on all sides by quiet apartment buildings and unremarkable city streets. There is no grand monument marking the spot, and there never has been one at any point since 1945. Only a small, easy-to-miss informational sign, added by the city government in 2006, briefly explains to passers-by what once stood directly beneath their feet decades earlier. A regime that obsessed endlessly over monuments, grand statues, and imposing architecture ultimately left behind none of its own at the one specific location that mattered most to its final chapter. Strip away the specific dates, names, and individual events, and the bunker's physical design still quietly tells its own story. It was a structure built in expanding layers of paranoia, each new wall thicker than the one built directly before it, each new room positioned further from daylight and further from anything resembling honest truth. In the end, the most heavily fortified building constructed by the entire Third Reich could not protect its own architect from the one force that 3 meters of reinforced concrete could never fully stop: reality itself, arriving exactly on schedule, regardless of how deep anyone chose to hide from it.